of Hawaii at Manoa, and Xingya Huang, the Distinguished Professor of American and Comparative Literature at National Sen University. What we'll do is have a sort of, we've discussed the format and it's a bit complicated, but I'll give you a brief preview. What we'll do is we'll have a kind of, we'll start out with Brian introducing the book. We'll then have a response by Brandy and Senya and me. Then Brian will then kind of respond once more, and then we'll have an open table kind of round table discussion among all of us. And at that point, I really invite you to join in and ask questions, and feel free to jump into the discussion. And we'll open it up to Q&A, which you can do either by chatting your question in the chat box over to the side, or doing the raise your hand symbol, and you can turn on your mic and camera and ask your question directly. But we really look forward to hearing what you have to say and having you join the conversation. And so I think without further ado, I'm scrolling through all of my kind of housekeeping notes. I will be very, very happy to hand it over to Brian, whose book Borderwaters is, we are very, very thrilled to celebrate the release of today. Thanks.
Brian, you have to turn on your mic.
Thank you so much, Senya. That's wonderful of you to point that out. I'm really glad. Thanks, Daniel, for inviting me to talk about Border Waters today, and for putting together this this panel with Brandy and Senya. I've admired their work over the years so much, and have learned a lot from them as I worked with them in putting together Archipelagic American Studies. Their essays were some of my very favorite to read through and to learn from. And Daniel, also from you, as you participated in the Archipelagos Oceans Americas Symposium of 2016 at BYU. It was great to get to learn from your work. And also a thank you to Christine Vicera for organizing this. What I want to do is just give about a 5-minute summary of Border Waters, hitting some of the main points before we move on to other points in the event tonight. So the standard narrative of the United States of America tells us that the United States is a continental country. We're familiar with the image of a United States intent on fulfilling its manifest destiny, crossing over vast continents of prairies and mountains and deserts, extending as a continental empire from sea to shining sea. We can trace the image of the United States as a continent all the way back to Thomas Paine, who in 1776 says that it was absurd for an island, that is Imperial England, to perpetually govern a continent, that is the nascent and settler colonial United States. In this conventional narrative of the United States founding and east-west expansion, the continent is the nation's founding and foundational geographical form. But Border Waters asks, what would happen if instead of looking toward the continent, we located the foundational US geography in the island ocean form of the archipelago? Now, for most readers, this will seem like a counterintuitive or even counterfactual proposition. But Border Waters reminds us that while it may be counterintuitive, it's far from counterfactual. In fact, the United States claims more ocean space than it does land space, and more ocean space than perhaps any other country in the world. And this is so by virtue of the many US claims to islands and archipelagos in the Pacific and Caribbean, and also by virtue of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which in 1982 provided for a nation to claim territorial seas out 12 miles from their shorelines, and then an exclusive economic zone 200 miles out from the territorial sea. This watery version of the United States isn't a secret. It's posted on a current website of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Titled Maritime Zones and Boundaries, this website hosts a document which states that, quote, the US exclusive economic zone is the largest in the world, containing 3.4 million square nautical miles of ocean, larger than the combined land area of all 50 states. The United States, the document asserts, is an ocean nation. So this is conventional US geography turned on its head. The United States becomes visible as a country made up predominantly of oceanic and archipelagic spaces, with just a minority share of the North American continent. I apologize, I've caught a bad cold. A minority share of the North American continent. How embarrassing. I'm really sorry. Let me see if I can work my way through this. It's just as surprising that the United States does not simply border two countries, that is the canonical Canada and Mexico borders. The United States actually borders 21 countries through its watery borders. And so in the book, I talk about a variety of test cases, thinkers, including Edward Glissant, Zora Neale Hurston, Florence Johnny Frisbee, Epeli Haofa, Craig Santos Perez. And the chapters redescribe the United States and its planetary embeddedness in a way that finds touchstones in a series of events relevant to empire and its ongoing lives. And these illustrations just point to some of the touchstones in the book. So Borderwaters was born of my own experiences growing up in Hawaii and Indonesia and Tennessee. These are settler, colonial, imperial, continental, archipelagic spaces that have bordered the United States or that the United States has claimed. And so this watery map of the US border waters may seem like common sense or settler colonial common sense to people who have lived in the border waters, but to the majority of US citizens and US watchers throughout the world, the border waters map turns the United States inside out and upside down. And so thank you, and thank you very much for your patience with me this evening.
The celebration is for you, so perhaps we can do more talking to celebrate you, and that way we can save your voice. Professor McDougall, I'll hand it over to you for your response, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. Mahalo, Daniel. Aloha mai na kupuna na aloha aina na kako'o na aloha aina na ho aloha mai kako. Aloha everyone. I wanted to say mahalo nui to Brian for writing this rich and compelling book, Borderwaters, to Christine and the Hong Kong University's Comparative Literatures Department for planning this event. Mahalo to my fellow discussants, Sinya and Daniel. I'm very honored to be joining both of you to discuss this great book. So as Daniel mentioned, I'm Randy Nalani McDougall. I'm an associate professor specializing in Indigenous studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. My Aina Hanau, or my birthland, is Kula Maui, which is on the slopes of Haleakala. And I live with my ohana in Aiea on the island of Oahu, right by Pu'uloa, which Americans renamed Pearl Harbor and is very heavily militarized. So it's a real pleasure to be here with you all today. And we were talking right before this event, and we found out that just between all of us discussants, we're representing 4 different time zones, and undoubtedly all of you are contributing your own time zones as well. So very welcome to have all of you join us here today. So I'm going to go ahead and share a presentation, and it's my way of kind of keeping me on track. I'm also, aside from being a scholar and a teacher, I'm also a poet, which also means I can tell a lot of stories. And I'm going to try to tell a couple of stories here and try to be brief about them given our time constraints as well. So let me go ahead and share these slides here. So these slides are intended to kind of help me along with my storytelling. Okay, so the first mo'olelo, which is a word that can be translated as either story or history in the Hawaiian language. This first mo'olelo is one of Pele, which some of you might know is the goddess of the volcano, Kilauea, on the Big Island or Hawaii Island. And this mo'olelo also features her sister, who is not as well known, her older sister, named Namaka'okahai. And Namaka'okahai is a goddess whose power comes from the ocean. And so this is actually a mo'olelo of how Pele came to Hawaii, because she wasn't from Hawaii initially. She actually came from Pola Pola in this mo'olelo. And she came out of strong conflict with her sister Namaka'okahai. And so because of these warring factions on the island, Pele left with some of her sympathetic brothers and sisters and started to find a new home. Now the mo'olelo goes that she arrived first on Kauai, and she had a big digging stick, and she used it in order to create what you see here are cinder cones, or pu'u Pele. And each time she kind of dug in her digging stick, she was trying to see if salt water was at the bottom of it, according to the mo'olelo. And if salt water did come up, meaning the ocean had access, she was worried her sister could come in and interfere with her finding a home. Okay, so she continued on down the chain of islands, the archipelago, and then she came to Maui. And Haleakala, which is where I grew up on the slopes of Haleakala, and Haleakala has a huge crater. So she was really hopeful that she'd be able to find her home there or build her home there. And so there's actually several pu'u that she created with her digging stick within the crater. I should mention tour guides at Haleakala will tell you that you can fit the city of Manhattan within the crater of Haleakala. I don't technically know what that means, but it sounds like it should be pretty big. But anyway, what I can tell you though for sure is that Pele created 13 different large pu'u or cinder cones trying to find her way there. And she was almost successful, except there was just a little teeny bit of salt water that she was able to cut, that kind of came through one of the pu'u that she dug. And unfortunately, Namaka o Kaha'i was able to confront her on Maui because of that. And so they had a big war on Maui, and actually Pele lost. She was killed by Namaka Kaha'i, and her body was flung on the other side of the crater and landed in a place in Hana that is still called to this day Ka'ivi o Pele, or the bones of Pele. However, her spirit was able to escape and return back to the summit of Haleakala and travel through a lava tube that connected to Kilauea. And that's actually how she was able to move from Haleakala to Kilauea and establish her home there, which was of course extremely safe from Namaka Kaha'i. Nevertheless, Namaka Kaha'i followed her there. And it's also how we see, this is a mo'olelo that's also kind of explains a lot of the conflict and tensions and that are happening, kind of like these violent ruptures that happen when lava meets ocean. So this is in the 2018 lava flow. Some of you may have seen images of this coming from Hawaii. Then they're quite striking. So this is on the Kapoho coast. Here's another one at Pahoa. When the lava meets the ocean, what is often created is what's called lays, for lack of a better term. We often would just call it wahi or smoke, but lays is lava haze, and it's extremely toxic. You can't, it's very, you can't live with kind of breathing this in, and it actually affected multiple communities on Hawaii Island. Here's a pretty striking aerial shot as well. Okay, so my second mo'olelo for all of you is the Mo'olelo of Maui, and this mo'olelo is very familiar to many children throughout Hawaii. So you're often told this kind of growing up, and it's basically of Maui, which unfortunately, I think what may come to mind for you might be kind of like the Disney version of Maui through the film Moana. It's really unfortunate because our mo'olelo are so much richer and really kind of give a lot more depth to Maui as a person, as a champion, and as a demigod. So mo'olelo of Maui from Hawaii describe his birth as being like he was born misshapen or deformed. He had a lot of physical disabilities by virtue of that. And so all of the amazing kind of feats that he was able to accomplish in his life are quite striking because of his being able to work through that physical disability. So the mo'olelo I'm going to share with you is the mo'olelo of Maui fishing up the islands, fishing up the Hawaiian Islands. So as the mo'olelo goes, Maui often wanted to hang out with his older brothers and sisters, or his older brothers, sorry, I don't think he had a sister, but the brothers never wanted Maui to come along with them, especially when they went fishing. They kind of looked at him as someone that kind of held them back. They never got to do everything they wanted to do. They always had to wait for him. Nevertheless, their mother forced them to take Maui along one day because Maui really wanted to go fishing. So Maui took his very famous fish hook called Manaya Kalani and went onto the canoe with his brothers, told his brothers to paddle far, far out into the deepest, darkest part of the ocean where there was nothing. And they kept paddling. They kept asking him if they could stop. He kept saying no. Finally, he told them, okay, it's time for you to stop. And they start making fun of him. How are you ever going to, pull up a fish? And you think you're going to pull up such a big fish? And they kind of haze him a little bit. But he says, just watch me, just watch me. Then he said, okay, these are my instructions for you. I'm going to put my hook in. And then when this fish bites, I need you to just focus on paddling as fast as you can to help me pull it up. Okay, so he's telling them he needs that force of them paddling in order to help bring up the fish. He says, and whatever you do, don't look back as I'm pulling up this fish. Just don't look back. And so his brothers, and you can see there's also certain ways in which this is really kind of connected to maybe certain biblical stories of Lot and so on. But his brothers end up sort of paddling as soon as Maui says, okay, I got a bite, go, go, go. And they're going and they can really feel the force of this fish. So they're like, wow, he's really got something. And they're still paddling out, and they're starting to get really tired. Maui tells them to keep going, keep going. They're like, how big is this fish? And so one of the brothers actually starts to doubt, and he says, I feel like Maui's really putting us on here. He's trying to make a joke out of us, and he's making us paddle him around, and there's nothing there. And so out of his doubt, he turns around, and immediately they all turn around and then drop their paddles, and the fish is no longer on the hook, and Maui's no longer able to bring it up. And what he did bring up were these islands here. So I wanted to share this particular image so you can also see kind of the ways in which all the islands are connected at a submarine level by a Brathwaite. And that's also, this mo'olelo is used to explain to children the ways in which our islands are connected under the ocean as well. Here's another image of kind of the seafloor and these connections. Okay, so what I'm really interested in when I was reading, and what I got really excited about in reading Brian's book, I'm approaching this, I should say, from an indigenous studies, decolonial praxis, Hawaiian studies, Pacific studies kind of background and training. So I was really interested in the decolonial potential of understanding how border waters amid the archipelagic states of America, what does thinking in those terms do for us, and what again is the decolonial potential of doing that? Because in Hawaii, and I share, a lot of you would be already familiar with some of these interlapping colonial creations of the archipelago that I've kind of listed here. I thought, by the way, Brian, I thought interlapping was really, really great for us to kind of think about in terms of ocean and land, but also ways in which often ideas of coloniality are often interlapped as well. And can even seem contradictory, yet they're both end up being accepted nevertheless. So all of you might be familiar to this, but are familiar with many of these things of archipelagos as being isolated, distant, small, inevitably overtaken, unknown and hidden. But I also wanted to point out, and this is specific to Hawaii, but also other spaces within indigenous spaces within the settler colonial United States of fantasy masking or legitimizing coloniality of those spaces. Let's see. And from this, I was also really inspired by what Brian discusses as terraqueous modes of knowing. I thought this was extremely rich. And so I have a couple of quotations that I found just really especially compelling for me about border waters being about decontinentalization, but doing it in a particular way that involves these terraqueous modes of knowing, and the submergence in water and churnings of the shoreline, really being foundational to that. So from a Hawaiian perspective, the interlapping of earth and ocean includes many things that I'm quite familiar with, just even in the two mo'olelo I shared with you. So including Aina, which is often kind of translated as only land, but from our perspective includes that which feeds us. So it includes, the ocean as well. The muliwai, or the estuary, which is where saltwater and freshwater kind of merge and create these like really fertile and kind of like fishery or nurseries for fish. The meeting of lava and ocean, most definitely, as I've shown. Also like the submarine, the Aina of the submarine Aina, which we can kind of see in the Maulaloa of Maui. And then also in the Maulaloa of Maui, the understanding that like human perception will always be limited and short-sighted, like within that space. So what do we do, I guess, with all of that? And I can talk about this a little bit, but July 31st is is a very important holiday within Hawaii. It's La Ho'iho'i'ea, or Sovereignty Restoration Day. And it's now celebrated every July 31st. It was to commemorate when the British, a British lord named George Paulet took over, unbeknownst to the rest of Britain, took over Hawaii and claimed it for the British crown. And that heva, that wrong, was corrected and sovereignty was restored 5 months later by the British crown. And so La Ho'iho'i'ea, as a Hawaiian kingdom holiday, emerged out of that. And now it has been reestablished and has been celebrated every year since 1985. And it was reestablished by the gentleman in this image to the left here named Dr. Kekuni Blaisdell. So I just wanted to, do we have time for a quick video before I end? I wanted to share this somewhat awkward a video that's been circulating on Twitter, and it's of Jill Biden's recent visit, or actually, I think she's still here, her visit to Hawaii. The purpose of her visit, in part, was to kind of celebrate Hawaii's, I guess, success in vaccination rates. And I'll just play this for you here. This is a moment where she's sort of confronted with the issue of Native Hawaiian self-determination and the illegality of Hawaii's annexation to the United States.
There's still a lot of pain and anger among the Native Hawaiian community over how Hawaii became part of the United States. Just was wondering, many still maintain a position that Hawaii is illegally occupied by the United States. Would you like to see dialogue between the administration on a federal level and Native Hawaiian leaders to try to reconcile this?
Okay, mahalo everyone. I just wanted to. Oh, whoops! I'm sorry.
And anger among the Native Hawaiian community.
Sorry, it's playing again. Let me stop.
How Hawaii.
I just wanted. I can talk about that more like during our Q&A for those of you who might be interested in all of the ways in which she's sort of circumventing and avoiding and kind of relying on all of those interlapping colonial fantasies that I mentioned before. But I'm also really excited to also hear from Sinya and Daniel. So I'll hand it over to both of them too. Mahalo, everyone.
Thank you so much. That was really, really beautiful. And I'm still catching up on notes, so thank you. I can't wait. But for now, I'll hand it over to Professor Wong for her response.
All right, good day, good evening, and good everything for everybody. It's a pleasure for me to be here to celebrate my good friend, Professor Brian Roberts' new book launch. And I think this is a very exciting moment for all of us. And I'm not going to show any PowerPoint, but this background that I have is an area photo that my student took over a field trip to one of the islands of Taiwan called Oki Island or Bangsa no Dawu. Taiwan is not just one singular island. Taiwan is an archipelago composed of 64 islands, and Oki Island is one of them, Bangsa no Dawu. And we were there for 3 days for field trip, and that's the aerial photo that we took of Oki Island, Borderwaters interfacing the Pacific Ocean, which is the pathway of crucial current. And I think Brian mentioned crucial in one of his map, the crucial from equator northward in the spring, bringing a lot of fish, to feed the indigenous people of the Pacific Islands. And Oki Island, or this border water, is right on the pathway of the Black Current. And the Dawu people, the Bangsa no Dawu, the Dawu people actually create a calendar which evolves around flying fish. So from February to June, following the Black Current, the flying fish go from the equator south to the north. And this flying fish provide nutrition and a lot of resources for the Dawu people to feed themselves and feed their offspring. So it's so abundant, the resources are so abundant that the fish that they catch between February and June will be able to feed the group, the community for the entire year. And for the fish that they cannot consume right away, they smoke it. So the year is divided into 3 seasons. One is frying fish season, and then post-frying fish season, and pre-frying fish season. So in other words, it's all frying fish. So this border water, or this terrain, is a terrain of nutrition that feeds the Bangsa no Dawu community, the indigenous community of Oki Island. And also it's the terrain where the human or the indigenous people encounter the non-human flying fish. They treated flying fish as their ancestors, returning every year annually to feed their descendants. And it's a touching story, and it's a terrain of human and non-human multi-species connectivity. So I just want to say ayoi. That's a way to wish everybody good life in Dawu language. So I can show you more images, but we don't have time for today. Today is Brian Roberts' stage. So I think his book really proposed a very challenging ocean-centered paradigm for thinking about the United States in the 20th and 21st century. So it's very current in the archipelagos of the Pacific Ocean and the Caribbean. In other words, he connects 2 oceans. It's not just one single ocean. And what border water that I just showed you at my background is the Pacific Ocean. Whereas his 2017 co-edited volume, Archipelagic American Studies, to which I contribute 1 chapter, offers an alternative way to structure knowledge in American studies. Borderwaters follow a similar line of thinking to remap the US as an archipelagic nation, or in NOAA's term, ocean nation. I have the opportunity to meet with the director of NOAA when I serve as the Director General of Ministry of Science and Technology for Taiwan. And I actually introduced, Brian, I actually introduced your work to him. So it's wonderful that you cited NOAA, which is a very science-oriented organization, official, of course, interpret the US culture in terms of waters over the globe, across the globe. So this book is seminal in 2 ways at least. First of all, it theorizes the rise of oceanic or archipelagic ways of reframing space-time cultures that are different from terrestrial or continental mapping. And this archipelagic approach pushes toward islands, oceans as interlocked formation that is reshaping American studies. But as I show you just now from my background, it's not just my American studies, but perhaps Pacific studies, Taiwan studies, and then Trans-Pacific studies. Second, it challenges the sovereignty of the several colonial states over waters and archipelagos that configure oceanic space from, I quote, a free non-national commons to an exploitable resource, end quote. So in this way, it creates tactics, terms, and tropes of a planetary poetics. So it's very poetic. So it's not just a kind of methodological or conceptually reasoning. Brian is a wonderful storyteller. He tells story in a kind of format of poetry. So I would say this is a poetic, planetary poetic, admitting the non-human subjectivity, as I just mentioned, the kind of human and non-human multi-species connectivity, as we enter and try to survive the endangered geoplanetary period called the Anthropocene. So environmental imaginary archipelagizes the continents. I really admire Brian's interplay of words. You know, for a Chinese-speaking scholar, it's really hard, you know, for us to create so many words out of archipelagos, verbs and adjective and everything. So emphasizing human culture's implication within the geological time frame. So it's about archipelagic thinking. It's not just about archipelago, archipelagic thinking, to think like archipelago. So it's an analogy to think like a mountain in Newport Ascent County Almanac. So after reading this, we have to practice how to think like an archipelago rather than think like a mountain, which of course is continental and terrestrial. So that kind of thinking is zigzag, reciprocal, mutual, cyclical. In the metaphor, this is beautiful, a stone skipping on the ocean. So Brian, probably you would like to elaborate a little bit on this. It's really, really a beautiful metaphor borrowing from Martin Lake poets' Caribbean theme. And also probably in the metaphor of spiral gyre of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. So I would like to reiterate the significance of this book in the context of the intellectual heritage of American studies, first of all, and then border studies, and then for the future, okay? So 3 points that follow. Understood as a global expansion of American studies, the discipline has gone through several stages of transformation in recent, let's say 2 decades, probably. First of all, the hemispheric American studies in 1998, and which of course has root in presidential address to the American Historical Association by its president, Herbert Bolton in 1932, and I think Brian mentioned this in his book, and it's called The Epic of Greater America. So from hemispheric American studies and then to transnational American studies, Shedifishkin 2004 presidential address for American Studies Association, which probably some of us consider to be one of the intellectual homes for our career. And probably Pacific Rim, Asian Pacific, Trans-Pacific studies at the very outset of 21st century, that is at the core of Asian Pacific studies. And probably Pacific studies started from Epeli Aowa revisioning the Pacific into Oceania as a full sea of islands, or probably Caribbean studies, as Gleason's idea of insularity is not a mode of isolation, but rather it's an opening, an island is an opening. So it's a huge tradition or intellectual heritage about islands and ocean, and in both the Pacific and the Caribbean. And then 2012, Chadwick Allen Trans-Indigenous, and now 2017, Archipelagic American Studies, all the way to 2021, Borderwaters. And I really would like to celebrate this by one of the technique Brian also used in his, I think, chapter 5, digital humanities, but I don't have, I don't use a kind of big data. I just very simply search the program book of 2019 American Studies Association annual meeting in Hawaii, which I think Brian Brandy has participated. I don't know about Daniel because I didn't meet you there. So I searched that. My keyword, archipelago, okay? So here you have the program committee formulate called Comparative Archipelagos, and then we have occupied archipelagos, visions of militarism, indigeneity, racialization in the Pacific, the recruiting archipelago, US military recruiting and the resistance in the Pacific. And Brian also submitted and of course presented panel, Archipelagos and the Times of American Studies, Past, Present, and Futures. And I think Brian can talk about that a little bit as well. And then from Hawaiian Archipelago, because you know that annual conference was organized in Hawaii, to Turtle Island, Trans-Pacific Trade Empires, Colonial Labor, and Settler colonialism. And this is also very relevant to Brian's book, Archipelagic Contact Zone, Archipelagic choreography, and so on and so forth. I don't want to go on, you know, it would take forever. The list cannot be exhausted. So in other words, it was published 2017, and in 2019, the whole program book somehow has islands, archipelagos everywhere, just everywhere. So I really admire this vision that Brian Roberts has ever since probably earlier than that, 2012. And I think that's the second point I want to make, from borderlands to border waters. And that's the term border waters, I think, from. So Brian attended the San Juan Puerto Rico American Studies Association annual conference. And that's the place where we met again. We met in Taiwan and then again in Puerto Rico, in islands, all right? And then in Hawaii, anyway. So islands are the encounters of this intellectual, or this group of intellectual people, all right? But in that annual meeting, I organized a panel called, I don't even remember, you know, it's Islands of Resistance, Taiwanese American Studies in the 21st Century. And then that is the time when Brian Roberts brought up Borderwaters in his book. Because one of the, I think one of the panelists, Yiping Liang, my colleague, in the end comments that islands are like borderlands. And of course, Brian does not quite agree, I think, right, at the moment. So it has to be border waters rather than borderlands. And we see how much this continental or land-based thinking has already dominated our mindset, our vocabulary, everything. So we want a word, and that word, as popular as it is borderland. And unfortunately, it does not really reflect that local native realities of oceanic or island communities. So from borderlands to border waters, and I don't think I would like to elaborate any further unless, you know, Brian want to again tell the story, but that's another encounter that we have, islands of resistance, and then from islands to borderlands, and then from borderlands to border waters. And apparently this is a much, much better metaphor. And I think Brian also explored the re-territorialization of the seas in the years following World War II. And I quote, I don't have the page number, it's funny that I didn't put the page number down, but lay a line, this discourse, the discourse of homeland security, the home securitization, and then the discourse of, you know, something like, you know, a kind of domestication in terms of homeland security, aligned with the political, technological, and conceptual shift that refigures oceanic space from, I have already used this one, free non-national commons to explorable or renewable resource, in extending territorial logics from land to seas. This discourse of securitization and domestication in the name of homeland security, whether attached to human or non-human entities, leave the sovereignty of the settler colonial stage unchallenged, end quote. And I think the book is exactly aiming to challenge this unchallenged sovereignty of the settler colonial state over water and islands. Number 3. Assembling archipelagic digital humanities, that is the convergence of digital humanities and archipelagic thinking in terms of distant and close reading. That's really interesting. So American studies as a discipline through digital humanities engagement with 3 major academic journals has been investigated in Brian Roberts' chapter. And the 3 journals, of course, are very familiar to probably people in American studies: American Quarterly, American Literature, Journal of American History. So I think this approach is wonderful in the sense that it's based on mutual illumination of multiple disciplines of humanities, social sciences, and natural sciences. And natural sciences, of course, Brian mentioned NOAA, that's geology, and it studied the air and the ocean in natural sciences. And here with digital humanity is AI technology and in a data-driven world. And that's the necessary step for the humanities scholars, you know, to consider as a kind of important approach in the future, in the near future. Okay, 2 questions, and I will end my response. Number 1, to understand and acknowledge our own positions in the circuit of power and knowledge. And of course, that positioning is important. So, but we have to open ourselves somehow to dispel this particular positioning in order to create the illusion of critical distance, right? So the first question I would like to address to Brian Roberts, or probably to all of you, is the positioning, you know, the question of positioning. As a US-based scholar, Brian, of course, takes a specific position, I think. It's US-based, right? But what is more interesting and intriguing to us is that Brian has a lot of experiences with Asian diasporic community, particularly the Japanese internment camp experience that he had field work. And he, I think, has a Fulbright fellowship in Indonesia. So today's topic is empire and afterlife. We are talking about afterlife. And this afterlife should come from each individual storytelling, lines of not only thinking, but lines of stories, testimonies, anecdotes from each individual positioning. So for instance, this launch party is organized by Hong Kong, right? So how do you talk about Archipelagic American Studies or border waters from Pacific Rim, particularly when China now is emerging as a superpower, and then these two superpowers apparently raise the significance of the Pacific. Not only the Pacific Rim, but the Pacific Basin and island chain. So I'm talking about the first island chain. Of course, we have Hawaii, we have Guam, we have Marshall Islands, we have Samoa, and so on and so forth. I'm talking about the first island chains. That is from Korea, Japan, and Taiwan at the middle point. All right, and then to Hong Kong, to China, to Malaysia, and all the way to the Philippines. So what if you position yourself in this island chain, first island chain, or like me, based in Taiwan? How would you interpret archipelagic studies or thinking differently? Okay, that's positioning. Number two, I love this epic from Brian's book. I quote, "For an archive like the waves of the sea." So beautiful, right? The archive is likened into the wave of the sea. And of course, the imagination is from Japanese Hokusai 19th century wood block print, The Great Wave. So the archive is the great wave. But there are so many imaginaries involving wave. For instance, I mentioned Bangsono Da'u at the background of this, of me. The Da'u writer, famous book, speak of indigenous Austronesian heritage, the memories of the woods, the waves, I'm sorry, not the woods. I'm so land-based, I'm sorry. So the waves, not the woods. And then a mighty wave in the stories of Erin Suzuki, Ocean Passages. And I hope Brian has a chance, or all of you has a chance to read this one as well, because it was also recently published, 2021, Ocean Passages, by approaching ocean passages, not in terms of establishing kind of singularity, but to open up to address the entanglement of the ocean passages, including, of course, many passages militarized, refugees, commercial, embodied, and visual passages. And one of the imagery or metaphor that Erin Suzuki used is a mighty wave. And that mighty wave, of course, is from Moakia in Hawaii. And that mighty wave is from 2019 opening plenary in American Studies Association annual meeting in Honolulu. The mighty wave as a foundation for inclusive Lahui nation building at Mauna Kea. So what I'm trying to say is that comparative methodology, that is another way to think about afterlife. You know, how the afterlife of archipelagic American studies or border waters amid the archipelagic state of Americas, probably is through reading distantly or closely, comparatively with books like Ocean Passages, or probably if you would like to think about the transcontinental railway, the Chinese or Asian, for instance, Japanese diasporic communities. And there is a book which was published 2019 by Stanford University. And you know the name Stanford, Leonard Stanford was the president of Central Pacific Company and used a lot of Chinese labor to build the transcontinental railways. And then the American become the superpower on the ocean, and you were able to connect the two oceans because of the labor of the Chinese railway laborers, workers. And the book is The Chinese and the Iron Road, Building the Transcontinental Railroad in North America. So let me conclude by reiterating very briefly these two questions I have. Number one, how to position yourself, ourselves, or each of us. Positioning definitely is important. It depends on where you base, where you position to look at the way archipelagic or island or ocean formulate our thinking or formulate our constellations of practices, right? And number two, comparative methodology. Would you consider archipelagic thinking as a kind of comparative methodology, and how it will benefit comparative literature, because our host is the Department of Comparative Literature. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much. That was an incredibly generative response as well. I am sorry to go last after these two brilliant responses. I hope you'll forgive me for following in their footsteps. But I typed my responses out, which is something I usually don't do, but the book really propelled me to want to type out the response, mostly because, Brian, it's a beautiful book. And I apologize that seems kind of so of a blunt description. I've been struggling to find the right word to describe the specificity of your argumentation style, which possesses both, I think, the force of urgency, along with a certain type of intellectual deference and humility. And I think the panelists here all see this kind of commitment to collaborative research, to collaborative storytelling, and collaborative work, academic work. And I think this is this combination of urgency with intellectual deference and humility is an ideal form of academic writing that non-piously refuses to shirk away from making demands, while nevertheless acknowledging the necessity of a community-based project. And I'm thinking here also of Claire Hemmings, who has written about how feminist theory has told stories about itself as an academic field, and how this allows and also forecloses forms of academic knowledge. And I think, Brian, you might be doing this for American studies, but opening it up in new and exciting ways, telling a history of American studies, which then makes it possible to tell new stories about American studies. So I find myself regularly haunted by the image of some future archaeologist whose work would successfully prove that there was, for approximately 4 centuries, a continuous civilization that stretched from the west coast of Africa to the east coast of North and South America. There would be chicken and fish bones enough to suggest a relatively healthy diet for the unknown number of people whose skeletons stretched across the North Atlantic world. This unfortunate archaeologist would have discovered a civilization, perhaps, but only one in its most horrifically realized form: 6,000 miles of massacred people, bordered on either side by enslavers and the enslaved, colonizers and the colonized. The other image is less horrific, if not less confounding. At a conference at BYU in 2016, Brian, you had us recall a grade 9, you had me recall a grade 9 geometry course with a reminder that shorelines, and therefore islands, and therefore archipelagos, have edges that are fractal. A fractal, and here I quote Wikipedia, and I refuse to elaborate because I have no ability to, is a space that with a dimension that strictly exceeds its topological dimension. Fortunately, for those of you who are deeply unsatisfied with that Wikipedia, the first line of Wikipedia, Brian reiterates and elaborates this claim in chapter 4 quite beautifully. But the archipelagic shoreline is always exceeding a Euclidean relationship with its own space. To think archipelagically is to move beyond not only fixed borders and boundaries, but to move alongside an infinitely discontinuous conjunction, just to borrow a phrase from Benitez Roja. And so the sea is history, as Walcott and Glissant have told us. But as Brian writes, so are the shores that it changes with every wave. both receding from us, as is the case for like the Outer Banks in North Carolina, where I grew up, or expanding like the US empire and its conflicted self-image, like Brandy mentioned. The challenge I think that Brian comes to and forces us to think about is to think about all of these simultaneously, or like Brandy pointed out, I think re-evoked a beautiful phrase, to think terracuously. And I'm thinking somehow in contrast to this horrific archaeology of the future, we have the autodidactic intern Japanese archaeologists that you write about, discovering a different way of thinking about the world, on their own. Brian's work is focused on the expansive oceanic empire in the 20th and 21st centuries. I think it was just last week I came across a meme. This is, you can see my resources are Wikipedia and memes. I'm truly a scholar. The French Empire is still alive and well enough that a person can actually fly from Paris around the world back to Paris without ever leaving France. That's how France conceives of its empire. And I tend to work on an aggressively maritime empire, which is the British Empire, whose imperial aspirations were marked by the Atlantic slave trade, the Suez Canal, the forced migration of labor from across one side of the Indian Ocean, the movement of opium across the other side, and the creation of new forms of indentured servitude in the Pacific Ocean. Sinya and it's kind of described some of this just now, and Lisa Lowe has highlighted how these are intimate oceanic projects: the abolition of in the Atlantic Ocean of the slave trade, which is the ability to sell other people into labor; created in the Pacific Ocean, free labor, the ability to sell yourself into labor, into slavery. Hong Kong has been the hostage of imperial handovers and pompous political maneuvering between at least 3, if not 4 empires since the mid-19th century. The British Empire, whose desperate desire to win something against the Qing dynasty drove them to invent sovereign territory. The American Empire, who continues to think of the island as no more than a relay for spies and large amounts of money, but whose denizens barely deserve after any kind of thought. And the Chinese Empire, which sees Hong Kong exactly the same as the American Empire. Brandy has described the archipelago as both a geographical and a state formation idea. And in the 21st century, the relationship between capitalistic empires and the promise of global climate catastrophe seems to suggest a new confrontation with these two modes of archipelagic thought, geologic and state. So what does it mean? And I guess this is responding to Sunya's provocation at some point, to think from Hong Kong. What does it mean to think as an archipelago now, especially in the South Pacific, simultaneously facing rising ocean levels, which are destroying low-lying islands, while simultaneously caught between disastrous, if not murderous, interests of multiple competing empires? So what I think my question would be then, what might a proper decolonial and perhaps planetarily poetic response, what might a properly decolonial, planetarily poetic response be to this, and one that is simultaneously and synonymous with this beautiful term, Brian, which you use, decontinentalization. So those are the kind of questions that I want to leave with, and thank you again for such a phenomenal book and for bringing these questions to light. I will let you decide, Brian, if how much you want to talk. Otherwise, we can also open up to question and answer. I imagine that there are a lot of people with questions, and we can all try to answer them. But I'll hand it over to you. Thank you again, and congratulations.
Thank you all so much. I'm so honored to have you engage with my work like this. Three brilliant people that I've admired, scholars, and it's just really genuinely a thrill to and something that I think of as a gift. And so I thank you. I'll talk my way through some of the points that you all made And thanks for your patience if my voice is hoarse, craggy, or something worse as I work through this. I'm hoping that that I can work through it fairly well. So Senia mentioned 2019 American Studies Association convention session that I organized with Michelle Stevens and others called Archipelagos in the Times of American Studies. And that was a moment when I was working on Borderwaters, trying to work my way through chapter 5, where I was, and chapter 4, where I deal a lot with archipelagos, not only as a spatial heuristic, but also a temporal heuristic. And so I was reading on archipelagos in time. And one of the sources that I bumped into was Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of history. And I had heard about these lectures for a long time. One of my main points of interest or entrance to these lectures had to do with my background in African-American literary studies, where I had heard that W.E.B. Du Bois learned allegedly from Hegel that Africa is an unhistorical continent, and a lot of the Souls of Black folk was responding to that. I was interested to see what Hegel had to say about continents. And I'm probably rehearsing to you what you already know Hegel says about continents. He says the continent is the fundamental stage of history. He says that history started in Asia, on the Asian continent, but the Asian people couldn't quite bring it to a culmination. It certainly didn't go to Africa, according to Hegel, because he indeed says that the continent of Africa is an unhistorical continent. It wasn't yet the continent of America, as he said, that's the continent of the future. But the continent of Europe is where history, full human consciousness occurred. One of the interesting things to me about this deeply troubling, deeply racist account of all of history is not only Africa as an unhistorical continent, but the continent as the fundamental stage. Africa at least had its continentality as an entrance potentially into history. But Hegel has some choice things to say. He says, history cannot happen on a desert island. And to him, as far as I could tell, all islands were desert islands, except maybe the island of Britain. He looked at the Pacific and said, how could it be that history would happen there? And this was one of the heights of absurdity to me. He said, because these islands are young, mostly made of coral. And I thought, what would coral have anything to do with history? How could coral possibly detract from historicity, right? He looked at the Caribbean and he said, all of the indigenous people of the Caribbean are dead. And so clearly that is not history. So history can't happen on an island. This seems so ludicrous, so absurd, so racist, this model of Hegelian history, that we can laugh at it. And yet it has enormous gravity today, incredible gravity today. Hegel talks about, okay, well, where in Europe did history start? It was in France, Germany, and England. You look at the places that US scholars want to apply to Fulbrights, France, Germany, and England. The gravity is incredible for this narrative that Hegel advanced, and that and this brings me to another point that Brandy mentioned. She mentioned the the inspiring account of Maui's hook pulling up the islands. I think that something as powerful, analogously powerful as Maui's hook and Maui's vision is what is required to begin seeing the islands, literally pulling up the islands when continental gravity wants to pull them down, wants to obfuscate them. Brandy also asks a question that has haunted me the entire time that I've been working on archipelagic thinking. Which is, what is the decolonial potential for archipelagic thinking? It's haunted me, not to say that it hasn't been present, but to say that it's always been present with me as I've been thinking about this, precisely because so many of the planet's most astute archipelagic thinkers are also decolonial thinkers. And in fact, I would say that you go back to somebody like Thomas Paine, who was not an archipelagic thinker, he was a continental thinker. And he said, small islands are proper for kingdoms to take under their care. So what we have is a dual action that is oftentimes little seen. Oftentimes when we talk about colonization, settler colonialism, imperialism, we see the imposition of a powerful geopolitical agent's will upon a allegedly less powerful geopolitical agent's will. The more powerful agent takes full control of the means of violence in the society. And therefore we have imperialism, we have settler colonialism, we have the displacement of indigenous epistemologies and ways of life and governance and sovereignty. But what we don't see is the geographical and geological architecture of the island versus continent mentality upon which imperialism and settler colonialism has so often hinged. Islands have been treated like, I don't know what is a good metaphor. I'm not into sports at all, but I'll say like footballs. And that status of islands is, you know, where do you want to go? You want to go to, I mean, where do so many scholars want to go? They want to go to Europe. That's where they want to study. That's where they want their archives. That's not only Europhilia, but it's also continentphilia. So then I guess working toward what Brandy asked, what is the upshot of archipelagic thinking for decolonization? I would say that archipelagic thinking is a foundational mode of thought toward decolonization. But I do not see it as having the function of immediate decolonization, not because that would not be desirable, but because it seems to me like there are layers that the European, Euro-American, imperial colonial world have set up. One is a layer of sheer power, the power of the gun. The other is the layer of geography and meta-geography that so frequently has to do with the continent and the island and the stories we tell and the ease with which people can laugh at phrases that involve islands. I mean, I teach courses that in which we talk about islands, and I teach landlocked students, majority, and they'll often say, I was surprised that we studied such a small topic. Or you look in the New Yorker and there's always the running island, stranded on a desert island gag. So I do think that archipelagic thinking, in no small part because so many archipelagic thinkers have also been decolonial thinkers, is fundamental to decolonial thinking in ways that have yet to be fully appreciated. Sinya asked about, rightly, Sinya pointed out my US situatedness. I definitely am US situated. I live in Utah. I've lived here for the past 13 years. And I grew up in Tennessee and Hawaii, which has been part of the United States imperial archipelago, but has also been part of a sovereign Hawaiian archipelago, in which, especially as I worked with Brandy on her essay, she taught me a lot about how to see the place where I grew up, which was at a certain point, I think I said something like, well, the United States claims sovereignty, and Brandy came back and said, Hawaii is a sovereign country, or Native Hawaiian sovereignty continues. And I was grateful to her for patiently explaining that to me and making it clear at the same time. I've only had a chance to visit Taiwan. And so Sinya asks, how would you, what good is archipelagic thinking for considering the case of Taiwan, where we have two superpowers in conflict, one claiming ocean space outside of 1982 UNCLOS, which would, and claiming ocean space in ways that don't comport with 1982 UNCLOS through the 9-dash line. And another who is consistently driving or sailing ships and battleships and other military apparatuses through what it is claiming to be open sea. The dilemma reminds me of something that Craig Santos Perez once suggested to me, or a story that he once told me. And it was a story that was unresolved. He said, when I visited Hawaii and the University of Hawaii, I believe it was in 2011, he told me the story of being in a creative writing class and teaching a man from the US military. And Craig had said something to the effect that Guam should be free. And the man from the military said, how can you free a place that is so strategically important? And I don't remember that Craig told me what his answer to that man was. But I would suggest that in the most recent issue of the American Quarterly, there's a special section on Taiwan, if I'm remembering right. And the editor of this special section suggests that archipelagic thinking is a third way beyond the empires, beyond these two massive competing empires, where the archipelago becomes something beyond these the continentality of the empires. I've read that introduction and I find it promising. And one of the things that Sinya taught me when I visited Sorry, and thank you for your patience. When I visited Taiwan in 2015 was concerning the indigenous populations of Taiwan as an archipelago. And I believe that indigeneity promises something in tandem with the archipelagic thought beyond these two competing empires. Daniel, thank you for your comments. And I'm really grateful for your description of my work as having a force of urgency and at the same time an intellectual deference. It's a deference because I find that, as Sinya has mentioned, I've had various experiences. I have experiences in here in Utah when I visited the site of the former Japanese American internment camp. I've had experiences in in Taiwan when I have visited museums and seen and learned histories. I've had experiences in Indonesia as I've thought about the United States involvement in the coup of around 1968 and the mass killings. I feel like I find kin and an ally in Brandy when she says something like, "Our human understanding is limited," and I'm doing the best that I can as I seek my own contingent human understanding, and yet at the same time, I do see the urgency and feel the urgency of what it is to live within an empire, what it is to live on a planet that has multiple empires, and the urgency that people have self-determination, that they have the sovereignty that really in a lot of ways is foundational to some foundational documents of the United States founding, although certainly not practice. And so Daniel writes, Daniel asks, what might a decolonial planetary poetics and how might it respond to empire? It's a big question. And I feel like as I've talked through my response to Brandy and Sinya, I feel like in some ways I've answered that question, but I guess just to conclude, before we turn it over to more organic dialogue with among participants and the audience, I'll mention, let's see, it's chapter 5 of Borderwaters, in which I talk about the United States Empire and I'll say the United States Empire, and I'll say all empires here will have their end. There is absolutely no doubt about that. There's this question, well, when will the United States stop controlling the island of Hawaii? Well, I can't remember the exact figure, but according to the best guess of scientists, that island will be submerged by the ocean through erosion 70 million years from now. And so certainly that will be the end of US domination of the island of Hawaii. But the thing is, in some ways that's just, oh, okay, whatever, 70 million years from now. But the thing is, I think that's the first step in coming to some admission that it doesn't have to be impossible to imagine the end of an empire. it will happen, definitely. There is no doubt. And then once you've got that thesis, then you roll things back and you do something like say, well, this is still in the realm of people's lifetimes living today, that the United States stopped controlling the Philippines. It's still in the realm of people's lifetimes today, that in around 1982, I believe, the United States made an agreement with the Cook Islands and New Zealand that it would relinquish its claims to the island of Puka Puka, where the Cook Island Puka Pukan novelist Johnny Florence Frisbee is from. And so I think what we have is the archipelagic as a precondition for something like a third way, and that third way as a precondition for decoloniality. And that's what I hope to have contributed to with Border Waters, a reevaluation of the United States, so that finally, say, my neighbors here in Utah can learn, or in many other places, can learn that there are people who are American citizens who have put their fists up in the air and said, we are not American. We will never be American. It's a strange double movement, which is, let me show you an American who puts her fist up in the air and says, I am not American. I will never be American. I will die as a Hawaiian. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian, and congratulations. I want to take this time. We're running a little bit short on time, and so Brian, I think you will just get to. We will all defer to you as to when you are ready to go to bed. You have the latest time zone of all of us, but I would like to open it up to questions from anyone in the audience. It was a beautiful response to two beautiful responses, and thank you so much for this great conversation. Oh, and just as I was about to launch into a question, here's a better one from the audience. I'll read it to you. It is also in the chat. I'm thinking of how empires in the Pacific have been overlapping and sometimes collaborative, and not just competitive or exclusive, as the panelists have discussed in the context of US-China. I'm thinking of the Western Pacific's histories of blackbirding, slavery, indentured servitude, and indentured labor of Pacific Islanders in Australia, the Anglo-French condominium over Vanuatu, nuclear testing by US and France, tourism and capital flows by Japan and China. What are some of the ways that we can think of decoloniality in relationship to this multiplicity? I will. Yeah.
Oh, it's such a good question, and I mean, the question has to do, yes, like you say, with overlapping empires and overlapping sovereignties. And it's a weird question to address in the context of a few things. One is, I mean, on one hand, I say, look at what has happened in these places where, as you've used this term, there are condominiums, I mean, collaborations among empires. This is not the standard Westphalian model of sovereignty. And in that way, one of the things that it does is disrupts the standard Westphalian model of sovereignty, the model that says everything that is claimed by the United States or is claimed by China is the sole property and the sole of the United States or of China. Once you disrupt the Westphalian model, there's room for alternative models of sovereignty. And So in that way, I see these overlapping empires as potentially positive, and that they forge a disruption. And one of the things that I've wondered about that I don't have a full answer to, and Brandy might have some commentary, or maybe Sinya, is how is the notion of, say, Hawaiian sovereignty or indigenous Taiwanese sovereignty related to the Westphalian notion of sovereignty, related to or different from? Brandy or Sinya, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I could share a little bit. Yeah, mahalo for your question too. So my understanding, so the Hawaiian word for what we translate as sovereignty is ea. So that's why in the holiday I mentioned is la ho'i ho'i ea. So ho'i ho'i is to return to, or the restoration of, and ea is sovereignty. But it's also translated as, you know, life and breath even. So it's really, I guess from a Hawaiian standpoint, it's something that's inherent within us, that if we are alive, we have some measure of sovereignty, and that there's so much in us, if we are alive, that wants to be free and able to be who we are and connect with our lands. So that's also another element. It's very, from a Hawaiian standpoint, it's also very connected to lands. This is the case within a lot of like indigenous conceptions of sovereignty as well, that our ea comes from our aina connections, our connections to land, and being able to learn from our land and grow with our land. It's also a concept that we learn from our land and waters, you know, in something that we can observe just naturally in the way that in Hawaii and our islands, you know, our stream flow it originates in springs in the mountains and flows all the way to the ocean. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen very often now with many of our streams because of colonial water restrictions and water regulations. But it's something that we can observe in aina that is regenerative and fertile. And so in seeing that, that's what we also like want for ourselves, because we are connected to our land. So we see it as sort of, you know, kind of tied to that, and something we're also always in the process of learning about. Yeah, I hope I hope that doesn't sort of add to any confusion, because we're still in the process of learning. When I shared the story of Maui about how, you know, human perception is always limited and somewhat, you know, short-sighted, it's also immature in the grand scheme of, you know, the natural world. Like, we are of course a part of the natural world, but we from our stories, and this is also the case with many other indigenous knowledges, we are the youngest as humans, and so we should always be in a process of learning from the world around us. And these problems have arisen because we've overstepped, and because we're sort of short-sighted and limited in our understanding, all of these problems have arisen within our planet. Empires have been created, disruptions in our connections with our lands and waters have happened.
Thanks for that commentary, Brandy, and also for that question.
Well, I just want to speak a little bit about sovereignty. I think there are many different ways of interpreting sovereignty. From the indigenous way, definitely it's a connection with the island, with the ocean, and with our land, and the land right to the environment and the ecology that surrounding us, our ancestral spirit that is, located in the land itself. But the modern nation state sovereignty definitely interpret this in a very different way. And we have to also pay attention to indigenous people do not always stay on the land or their homeland. They can be diasporic, right? So how to articulate, how to bridge this kind of description or demarcation, of nation state, of modern thinking, modernity, the device, right? And I think borderlands, or in this case, border waters, definitely, or interlapping, sort of, different disciplines, or in the language of this question, multiplicity. So in other words, everybody is on the road. We do not just look at something that is indigenous or deeply rooted in the land, but also we open up the possibility of encounters with the other, of elsewhere. In other words, this encounters, for instance, of the indigenous subject with the diasporic subject definitely is important. The encounter of colonial subject and the native subject is important. So we look at this transient and this transition kind of terrain, transitional terrain as border waters. And this book title indicated is extremely important when we think about the colonial future. It's a future shared by people from below, people from the ground, people from the water, people from the ocean, people who has this very direct experiences with locality, with the particular site, or with our ocean planets. So in order to sort of bring in this multiple constellations of not only theories or knowledge system, but also practices, into our discussion is important. And the translation is also important in ways of to articulate, to articulate, to bridge the demarcation of the gap. It's always it's always important for us to share our understanding, to translate our thought from our personal belonging, our personal positioning, to think what other people would think, to reposition ourselves, to change our position, to put ourselves in others' shoes. And I think that's extremely important. In other words, it's always in transition. Our identity, our sovereignty, our subjectivity is always in transition. And I think that's what the metaphor of, or the allegory of border waters has taught me. Yeah. Thank you.
There's another question that was direct message to me, and I think it follows on this question, both comments and the previous question as well, and it's one that I have been struggling to think about too. So apologies if I'm butchering the question in the direct message and also then butchering my own question. But I mean, the catastrophe of global climate change, just global climate catastrophe, is producing refugees from archipelagos, and it's happening to archipelagos first. It is already happened in many cases, and there are human lives who have been decentered, displaced, not merely by violence directly, but by violence in the kind of slow violence sense of rising sea levels. And then, of course, right, we've also talked about the displacement of humans by global flows of capital, so indentured labor, slavery, all of whom, these are people whose bodies have been moved across archipelagos and across oceans. and across border waters. And so the question is about, what is the relationship between the refugee or the forced migrant and the question of the sovereign and the indigenous, as opposed to the question of the settler colonial state, working underneath the settler colonial state. I question mark. I will.
A couple of thoughts here, and I'll start off just by commenting on the question of climate change and the way that islands and archipelagos and shorelines more generally experience the brunt of the effects of climate change. One of the things that sometimes you'll hear in the news is things like, oh, the islands are the canary in the coal mine. And I think that's, and of course we know we know that allegory well, which is you take the human takes the canary down into the coal mine, and when their noxious gas is released, then the canary dies, so the human knows to leave. And just thinking back to Hegel laying out the philosophy of history, we understand the geographical architecture of why islanders might be called canaries in coal mines, and that's something that we need to recognize and contest, avoid, reject. And in saying that, I want to make it clear that in no way am I suggesting that this question itself was doing that. The question, though, leads me to think of other commentary that I've heard, and then and then we think also about the way that many people who have become refugees, climate refugees, are come from islands and shoreline places. And they're moving, they're not sticking, as Sinya says, with their lands and waters, because maybe it has become impossible, physically impossible to stick with those lands and waters due to capitalist resource extraction, carbon economies. And so they need to move to other places. But one of the things that does is take these refugees, who some might take as canaries, but it takes them to other places where I would take them as philosophers, thinkers, actors, in building a different world in which islands and oceans are not the tragic commons of the continents, the empires, but that they are mainlands and main waters. And so those are a few thoughts in relation to that question. Thank you for it also. Other questions? I know we're running late. Well, we're running late all over the planet, but especially where it's 10 till midnight.
Then perhaps, Brenda, did you want to add a comment briefly?
I was, the question made me think about, and even the one from Majida, it made me kind of think about the ways in which settler coloniality often creates divisions and separations and conflicts between colonized people and people who have been displaced and dispossessed. and how that often stands in the way of what could be extremely productive, of course, solidarities and movements with people. And that part of the, I guess, experience of coloniality means that you don't get to exercise your sovereignty in terms of consent with people visiting you in your home, or you even being able to welcome them. And that can, at the very kind of base level, it can complicate your relationship with people who are there not by virtue of you welcoming them, but by virtue of their being placed there, you know, sometimes even against their will, forced to migrate by the settler nation state. And so you can kind of see how that creates these spaces. But the settler colonial state also has a vested interest in maintaining those divisions. So there's all sorts of ways in which it also plays groups against each other, or produces situations of scarcity, whether or not they're actually within a scarcity situation. I'm thinking in particular of, there's been a lot of discussions in Hawaii, in particular between certain Micronesian groups who have been displaced or have been forced to migrate, sometimes through health reasons, other like economic reasons, sometimes through US military, all sorts of reasons. But there have been, you know, strong tensions between Hawaiian communities and Micronesian communities. And so I was just actually attending a panel discussing solidarities yesterday about that. So that's what I had in mind.
If that's okay, I think that was the most beautiful last word to end on. Opening up towards solidarities in archipelagos. Just briefly, I want to thank everyone once more. Thank you, Brandony. Thank you, Sonia. Thank you, Brian. Congratulations, Brian. Thank you, everyone, for staying up late or staying past lunch or waking up early, wherever you were, staying past dinner. And thank you so very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be here. I feel really honored.
Thank you very much. And Brian, good night.
Yeah, mahalo. I hope you feel better soon.
Stay well, rest well.
Okay. Thank you.
Really impressive. You're still so brilliant despite, like, you know, working through a cold. Yeah.
Midnight party.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
It's been so good to see you all.
See you again very soon, hopefully.
Yes. Aloha.
Aloha.
Aioi.